passage is about the pandemic, the changes that happened during the pandemic, and something about how it affected the way we think and the way we take decisions. Let's first summarize the passage. There was a lot of big talk during the pandemic as we used that eerie combination of silence and panic to re-evaluate our priorities. So what happened during the pandemic is there was a combination of silence and panic. And this eerie, weird combination made us re-evaluate our priorities. What do I really want in life? What am I doing? What do I really want to do? Which one is highest on my list of what I want to do? So re-evaluate your priorities. Fear of change evaporates when everywhere you look there is upheaval you didn't choose. So your fear of change evaporates when you see everything changing fast around you and you don't seem to have control over it. You didn't choose to have that change around you. Why not do that thing that you've always wanted to do? Chuck in your job, get an iguana. Practically speaking, it was a new world in which life of the city was all downside and no up. So he said the pandemic was introduced us or gave us a weird world where life in the city was all downside and no up, had seemed to have no positives. Suddenly, the relationships you thought would endure till death parted wouldn't last 5 more minutes. Suddenly, marriages broke. You thought that was a partnership for life, but you found that just broke. At the same time, the person you met on Wednesday was now living with you. So relationships change. The pointlessness of your job leapt out at you. But was it the work itself? What's the point of doing work? You kept asking, what's the sense in doing all this? That pointlessness of your job leapt out at you. But the author is asking, is it the work itself or is it a proxy for modern life? Okay, was it the pointlessness of work itself or was it just about life in general? Okay, so a very some philosophical deep thoughts there. Especially in 2020, this all looked as though it was going to bring about huge life changes. So in 2020, after a year of going through all that, he says it looked as though all these changes were going to effect even greater changes. By August of that year, so he's now talking about the changes. By August of that year, 1 in 7 Londoners wanted to leave the city. Nationally, 4 in 10 people were more inclined to look for houses in rural locations than they were before. Developers in Manchester, Leeds and Liverpool were panicking. In early 2021, one estate agent noted the largest exodus out of London in a generation. People just went out of London. They preferred rural locations and places, developers, builders, house builders in Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, all these are cities, were panicking because people didn't seem to like the fact of living in the city. They were preferring the quieter countryside. Meanwhile, inquiries to divorce lawyers soared. So one was this mass exodus from cities to villages. In England, they call the country. And the second part here is that divorces increased. Inquiries to divorce lawyers soared. One firm, Stowe Family Law, reported an increase of 162% between 2020 and 2021. As inquiries fed into actual divorces, the Courts and Tribunals Service showed 3,000 divorces registered in the week 6th April 2022. The average for the year before was 2,000. So there were lots of inquiries for divorce. And when these divorces, ones which went from inquiry to actually filing the divorce case, there were 3,000 registered in 1 week in 6th April 2022. The year before it was 2,000. So see the leap in the number of divorces filed. When the dust had settled, so these are the effects of the pandemic. Now let's see. When the dust had settled, however, when things had settled down, however, a lot of changes were not as stark as all that. It wasn't that big an upheaval as you thought. A lot of changes weren't as stark as all that. Urban life recovered its luster. The city suddenly started looking better. It's recovered its luster. Luster means shine. And many of those ex-Londoners turn out to be young people who had just temporarily moved back with their parents. Liverpool ended up with a higher population than before. People largely didn't leave their jobs. If they did, it was only to move to another one. So it's not like they gave up jobs altogether. They largely didn't. If they did, it was only a job change. Okay? A timeless choice. Rates of economic inactivity were unchanged. If there was a labor shortage, blame Brexit. Marital breakdown turned out to be more complex, possibly thanks to the introduction of no-fault divorce or COVID-related financial pressure rather than the pandemic. Yes, the rate of divorces increased. But marital breakdown was a big change. But he is saying that is not because of the pandemic. It was maybe thanks to the recent introduction of the no-fault divorce or COVID-related financial pressures. It was not pandemic-related. It was not the pandemic itself that caused breakup in marriages. It was the financial pressures due to the pandemic. One thing, or 3.2 million things to be precise, that COVID can take credit for is an influx of pets. Lot of changes. Marriage he has talked about, city to village, city to countryside, and coming back after the pandemic. Marriages, of course, breakdown of marriages continue, but he says that's because of financial pressures. But one more, influx of pets. Everybody started having pets at home. There was a huge rush for animals during the pandemic. A staggering 33% households now have at least one dog. Nonetheless, this decade has thrown up some weird conditions in which to make a major decision. See how beautifully he ended this paragraph. He said, but one thing, huge increase in the number of pets owned by people, 33%. Then he says, this decade has thrown up some weird conditions in which to make a major decision. Now comes the main part of the paragraph where he talks about decisions. He says, you would expect some people to have regrets, right? Sometimes you take a decision and during the pandemic, after whatever, about moving from a city, about a marriage partner, about a pet. But he says, you would expect some people to have some regrets, right? Any choice made in the middle of a crisis will have impulsive elements. In a crisis, you cannot be cool, calm, and composed. There's always, and if you take a major decision when you're in a crisis is a crisis, is an abnormal situation. So he says, any choice made in the middle of a crisis will have an impulsive element. Uncharacteristic thought patterns. Surely, some of those choices will have turned out badly. So some of the decisions that we made, choices we made on the basis of more impulsively because we were in the middle of the crisis, would have turned out to be bad decisions or bad choices. Well, yes and no. So basically he's saying during the pandemic, people made good and bad choices. Yes and no. Both. Regret doesn't quite work like that. Fuchsia Siroy, a psychology professor at Durham University says, so there's a psychology professor who talks about how does regret work. When you make a bad decision, you regret it, right? So during the pandemic, it was an abnormal situation. It was a period of emotional turmoil, and impulse and emotion, when it plays part of a decision, obviously certain bad decisions would have been made. So he says, yes and no to that. And then he quotes Fuchsia, a professor who says this. There's a natural human reaction to mistakes or decisions that we might regret initially. He says, yes, the natural reaction is we might regret a decision initially. Oh, why did I do that? They create a cognitive dissonance, a disparity between our thoughts and our behavior. Leaving that gap open, this change between our thoughts and our behavior, if you leave this gap open, creates aversive feelings and we try to close it. So it creates feelings of aversion, aversive feelings. So we try to close the gap between our thoughts and our behavior. They should be more aligned to each other. If we can close the gap with our behavior, reverse the decision, then we'll do that. So that there's a disparity between our thought and our action. We've taken our decision. Now we are regretting it. So there is this, it causes a disparity, a cognitive dissonance between our thoughts and our behavior. So what do? One is we try to bridge the gap. And how do we do that? By reversing the decision. Okay, change it. Go back. Reverse the decision. Then we'll do that. If it's possible, we'll do that. If it is irreversible, it is much easier to change the thoughts. So either we change the decision or we change our thoughts so that that regret we can overcome. Clear? Which of the following best describes the natural human reaction to mistakes described by Fouchier-Seroy? Remember Fouchier-Seroy in the last paragraph. Let's go back to the passage, to the last paragraph, and find out what is a summary of what Fouchier-Seroy said about human reaction to mistakes. The last concluding paragraph. There's a natural human reaction to mistakes or decisions we might regret initially. They create a cognitive dissonance, a disparity between our thoughts and our behavior. Leaving that gap open leads to aversive feelings and we try to close it. So when we make a decision that we regret, when we make choices that we regret, there is a gap between our thoughts and our behavior. We try to close that gap. It's not good for us. Okay, aversive feeling. So what do? If we can close that, if we can close the gap with our behavior, reverse the decision, then we do it. So one, we try to close the gap with our behavior by reversing the decision. Okay, going back, changing the decision. Second, but if the decision is something that cannot be reversed, if it's one of those decisions which are permanent, then it is much easier to change our thoughts. So if you summarize it, the answer would be either reverse the decision, second, or change your thoughts. Okay, change the decision or change your thoughts. So which of the options? We try to change both our behavior and our thoughts as we try to reconcile the gap between the two. Did he say try to change both? 2. Reverse the decision or change your thoughts. Change your decision or change your thoughts. Not both. Behavior and thought. Not behavior. We try to live with the consequences of our decision without worrying about our thoughts. He didn't say that. She didn't say that. We neglect the disparity between our behavior and thought. We don't, because that creates aversive feelings in us. We try to close the gap. So that's exactly the opposite of what has been said in the passage. We try to reverse our decisions. If we can't, we change our thoughts. Exactly what has been given in the passage. So my correct answer is D.